So how many of you have heard the word median before? Okay, what is a median? Yeah, so on a triangle, these are all the special lines in triangles. It's basically the same thing. So if we have a triangle, it goes from the middle, the midpoint of one side, to the opposite vertex. And because you're doing a project with this unit, you aren't going to have these words memorized, but you will have to be able to, if you don't have it memorized, come look it up here and say if it says to draw a median, I'm going from the midpoint of one side to the opposite vertex. Who knows what altitude is? It's just the height. And can it be slanted height, or does it have to be straight up and down height? So altitude has to be just perpendicular to the opposite side. So it's segment from the vertex and it's perpendicular to the opposite side. So do you see the difference between these first two lines? How median slanting to where the midpoint is, altitude just goes straight down to its perpendicular. All right, what do you think a perpendicular bisector is? So it splits it in half, so we're starting at the midpoint again. But instead of slanting to the vertex, it's just going straight up perpendicular. So do you see the difference between altitude and perpendicular bisector? Yeah, it's just where it starts. This one starts at the opposite vertex. This one starts at the midpoint. So see how they're both that straight up and down line. It's just where they start. And then see the difference between median, which starts at that same midpoint but slants to the vertex, whereas perpendicular bisector starts at the midpoint and goes straight up. Yes? Yeah, altitude and perpendicular bisectors always have to have right angles like that. And so as we're doing them, because your project's going to be graphing these and then also finding the equations of the lines and mathematically finding where they intersect. Okay, so then down below are the different centers of triangles. So our first one is Circumcenter, and it's created, can anyone tell what this is created by, what three lines are meeting in the center of those ones we just talked about? So can you tell which line the Circumcenter is created from? Yeah, and it's kind of confusing because it also drew these other lines there, but it's created from our perpendicular bisectors. Do you all know that this sign means perpendicular? Okay, if not, write that off to the side. You need to know this sign means perpendicular. And so our important fact is that the circumcenter is equidistant from each vertex of the triangle. Do you know what equidistance means? Yeah. And so this would be used if they're like trying to decide, hey, where do we set up a cell phone tower so it's equally spaced from these other three towers we already have up, or these three main locations we're looking at. And so that would be where they would search for something like this. All right, our in-center is one that is not going to be on this project, but it's just here as vocab for your reference. But it's created by angle bisectors. And the incenter is equidistant from each side of the triangle. So again, it would be used when they're planning things out. They want to find, like, hey, what's the exact center of these three sides? All right, our centroid, can you guys tell what lines those are that are intersecting for centroid? Are those the medians or the altitudes? Yeah, those are, so centroid is just the intersection of the medians. So centroid is just created by the segments connected to the midpoints of the opposite sides. And I'm sorry, these blanks are very small. Then lastly is our orthocenter. It's created by the altitudes. And it's just created by those perpendicular bisectors. Sorry, it is always going to be perpendicular. From the opposite vertex. So when you have all that, go ahead and flip over to the next page. All right, so this page is basically everything that you're going to be doing on your project, except the project does have, as a final step, systems of equations, and we'll review that next class for whoever needs the review. On your project, every group will get a different set of points. Here we're working off of these. So what is point G here? If we're just labeling that point. -8, and then, yeah, -8, -5. And then I is -6, 0. H, 0, -5. Okay, so I'm just labeling the 3 points that they already have graphed for me. On your project, you will get 3 points and you will graph them. So our first step is to find the midpoint. So centroid is the intersection of medians. Does anyone remember without looking what medians are? So medians go from the midpoint to the opposite vertex. So we have to find those midpoints because we need it to be exact. So our midpoint formula is our x1 plus x2 divided by 2, y1 plus y2 divided by 2. And I have 3 lines, so I have to do it 3 times. So G and I, I'm just adding my -6 plus -8 divided by 2, my -5 plus 0 divided by 2. What does that give me? In a new and mental math, -8 plus -6. Yeah, divided by 2 is -7. And this would be -5 over 2, or I'm going to go ahead and put it in the decimal format, so it becomes -2.5. Yes?
Do you have to put it in either decimal or fraction?
It can be in either. It's your choice. And so either fraction or decimal form is fine. I put it in decimal because it's easier for me to graph it in decimal. So I'm going to come here, -7, -2.5. That lands me on the line. Does that look like it's the midpoint of G and I? Okay. And so if you're having, as you're doing your project, you can always check. Make sure your numbers match up what you need to graph. If you did something wrong, your point wouldn't land there, and then that would give you the hint, hey, I need to go back and check it. We are going to label our midpoints D, E, and F. And so this is point D. Okay, would you take just a minute and see if you can find the next two midpoints? So I'm going to pause our video. Okay, so I'm just plugging in I and H. I add my X values to get -6, divide by 2 to get -3. I add my Y values to get -5, divide by 2, which is -2.5. And then for G and H, it's the same thing. So -8 plus 0 divided by 2, -5 plus -5 divided by 2. And that gives me the -4 and -5. Okay, so then I plot them on here. My next step is to draw the lines from the midpoints to the opposite vertex. And so I line up my F and my I. Our centroid, and your project will have these directions also, but centroid is just that connecting the points from the midpoint to the opposite vertex. You can freehand it, you can use the edge of your ID on the actual project you want to make sure you use a ruler. On your project, do you think you should do all this in pen the first time? No. No. So I strongly recommend notes I do in pen so that you guys can see it easily, but especially on your project where you're getting part of it is, hey, did you do it neatly? Make sure you do it in pencil, and then you can go back over it in pen. Question? DEF, just because I need to name the midpoints, and your project tells you to name each midpoint D, E, and F. Yeah. So I picked the letters to name those points. So we have now drawn the medians on the centroid, and so centroid is just where those three medians overlap. And so step 3 is we're going to estimate what that centroid is. So what do you think that centroid point is? Just based on the drawing. What's our X value? So it's between -4 and 5, so we're going to pick a decimal for it. What do you think? Is it 4.5 or is it a little more?
4.6.
Yeah, so I'd say anywhere like 4.6, 4.7, 4.8. But that's what an estimate is saying, hey, about where is that? How about our Y value? What would you say that is? Okay, so -3.2, 3.3, 3.4, any of those I'd say is in the right range. We just know it's not quite halfway down that square, so it's the -3 and a little bit. Okay. Your final step of the project will be using systems of equations to find the exact point, but we're going to estimate it first, and then you see, hey, did your answer for systems of equations come out close? So then the next step is we have to actually find the equation of each line, and because that's what you would use for your systems of equations. And so what can we do? If I'm trying to find line IF, what could I do to find the equation of that line? So the equation of a line is where we're going to use our y equals mx plus b. And I'm going to do it from 2 points. So I'm going to do it from my vertex, which I already have the point of, and my midpoint that I already have the point of. So that just means I have 2 steps, and this is what we did last unit a lot. Did you guys notice we skipped from chapter 3 to chapter 6?
Yeah.
So last unit was chapter 3, this is chapter 6, and we did it because this unit uses so much of what we used in chapter 3. It's just easier to do it right afterwards. So we'll go back to chapter 5 and 4 later. So first we're going to find the slope, which is our y2 minus y1 over x2 minus x1. And so I'm going to, we're going to find line Fi. We're only going to find one of these lines. In the project you would find all 3 of them. So my line in Fi, I'm just going to plug in my points. This is my x1, y1, x2, y2. Okay, so I take the 2 points I already have, I plug them into that slope formula. Sorry, that should be -5. So I should probably do it in the right order. Okay, my y2 number is, the way I labeled it, is 0. So 0 minus -5 over -6 minus -4. Okay, the reason we got these big calculators out is if you aren't good at the mental math with positives and negatives, you can type this straight in. 0 minus -5, and then 6 minus -4. Yeah, but the rule is 2 negatives in a row, you can join them to a plus sign. So that gives me 5 over -2. So -5 over 2. So that is my slope. That's my m. What is step 2 in finding the equation of a line? Yeah, we got to find b. So now we just do y equals mx plus b, and I plug in my points. Does it matter if I use these my x1, y1, or my x2, y2?
No.
No. Which one do you think is going to be easier to work with? Probably the one with 0.
Yeah.
Usually if there's a 0 in there, I'm going to pick that one just because it makes it easier. So I plug in my y is 0, my m is -5 over 2, my x is -6, and then plus b. Because b is what I have to solve for. Can anyone mental math -5 over 2 times -6?
30 over 2.
30 over 2, which simplifies to 15. You don't have to be able to mental math it. That's why we have the big calculators out. You do have to know how to multiply in your calculator if you can't mental math it. But you just multiply the tops and then divide by 2. And then we subtract 15 to get -15 equals b. And so then my answer is going to be y equals -5 over 2x minus 15. Okay. So that's a review from what we did last unit. That's what you're going to be doing. We did this last unit. It was on the test you took last class. That's why we're reviewing it. Alright, so the good news is our next one, Circumcenter, uses some of the same information we already found. So Circumcenter is made out of what? It says on your page here.
Perpendicular.
Yeah, so the first step is midpoint again. We already know our midpoint, so we're just copying them down. -7, -2.5, -3, -2.5, and -4, -5. So that's the nice thing about this this unit and then the project that you're going to do is it builds off each other. Once you found your midpoints, you just copy them down again. And so we're going to plot them again and label them DEF again. So do our perpendicular bisectors just connect to the opposite vertex? No, they're perpendicular. So we have to find our slopes and then our perpendicular slopes. So GI, how do we find slope from a graph? Yeah, so 2 ways. We can take the 2 points that we've already labeled, plug them into slope formula. We can also count out rise over run. Okay? It's your choice. If you're turning in a project there's a chance of the test grade and you know slope can be tricky for you, you might do it both ways and double check. But I'm going to count my rise as 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And my run is forward 2. I'm going to double check. Is GI a positive line? Yeah, if I come from here, I'd hit it and have to go uphill. Okay, IH, I count down 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then forward 6. So it's a negative 5, 6. And I double check, is IH a negative line? Because I'm coming here, I hit it, I have to slant down. And then GH, what's the slope of GH? 0. Now we find our perpendicular slopes. What are perpendicular slopes? And so if we're going from the points, they're just the opposite reciprocal. Reciprocal. So what is perpendicular to 5 over 2? Negative 2 over 5. What is perpendicular to IH?
6 over 5.
Positive 6 over 5. And perpendicular to 0?
Oh, undefined?
Undefined, yeah. Okay. So do you guys remember the saying, the hoi vux? Did we talk about that in this class? If not, it's here. So if it's a horizontal line, that means it's 0 slope, and it's a y equals equation. What would the equation of line GH be? So this would be y equals 0. Where is it hitting the y-axis? Y equals negative 5, okay? So just make sure when we have 0 or undefined slopes, there is still an equation. We still have to know where in the graph is it going to cross that axis. And so if I am now plotting this, so perpendicular to GH, I'm going to come here at the midpoint of GH and do my undefined line, which just comes up. I draw the square, make sure I do it right. What would the equation of this line be? X equals negative 4. Okay, so our perpendicular and horizontal lines, they still have names of the equations. They're just very easy equations to find. All right, and then the other ones, we're going to start here. So I'm going to start perpendicular GI. I start here at point D, and I have to count down negative 2 and over 5. So I start here, I'm starting at a half, so I'm just counting to the next half. 1, 2, and then over 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And I plot my second point just from the slope. Do you guys remember doing that? Where you just count out slope and then make a second line and then plot the equation by hand?
Oh, yeah.
Did you do that in Algebra 1, or did you use graphing calculator picks? Yeah. So you probably haven't done a lot of stuff by hand for a while. But then I am going to double check to make sure I did it right. When I line those up, am I hitting this line at a square, at a perpendicular angle? And so I'm just eyeballing it with my ruler and saying, yeah, that looks about right to me. So I do it by math, but I always check that what I'm actually graphing makes sense. Can I do the perpendicular symbol there? Does it make sense? Okay, the next one's a little harder because it's 6/5, and this graph isn't big enough for that. And so I have two options. I could count by halves, so I could do 6 halves and 5 halves, or I can just come down and keep drawing my graph and make it bigger. Which do you think would be easier? So this one, I think counting by halves is going to be easier this time because I'm starting in a half anyway. So I'm going to count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 halves, and then over 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 halves to hit in the middle there. And then this one I'm really going to check if I line those up, is that square with the edge? Square with my line IH, and it is, so I'm going to assume I did that right. Okay, so that was our step 4. We drew our lines. Now we're going to estimate our circumcenter. What do you guys think, that point where they all cross? What is our x value? Yeah, we don't have to estimate that one. We know it is because we already have the value of x equals -4. What's our y value? Okay, 3.678, maybe 3.9. It looks a little less than that. But we know it's going to be somewhere in that range, 3 point something over half. Okay, so that's our estimate. On this one, what are we going to use to find the equation of our medians? I'm sorry, of our perpendicular bisectors. That is a typo. This time, do we have 2 points to work with, 2 exact points? Do we have a slope to work with, though? And do we have 1 point to work with? Yeah, so this one's actually easier because step 1's already done for us. So we just use the midpoint and the slope that we already found. And so if I'm going to find my line that is perpendicular to GI, what is my midpoint of GI? Yeah, so I just take point D is my x1, y1, so -7, -2.5 is my x1, y1, and my slope, I already have perpendicular to GI, is -2/5. And so I just plug those into my y equals mx plus b to get -2.5 equals -2/5 times -7 plus b. And so this is where, again, I have a calculator, so I can put in that fraction if I want, or I could make it into decimal first, but I'm going to put in my -2/5 times -7, and it tells me it's -14/5, which I could have done that, sorry, it's +14/5. I could have done that by hand, but then I have a decimal on this side and a fraction on this side. What do you think is the easiest thing to do now? Try? Try's not easy. That's what we have a big calculator for. In the calculator, can I put in my -2.5 and then subtract the 14/5?
Yes.
Yeah. So that's why you have these calculators. I could put 14/5 into a decimal first, or I can just do it this way and type in the calculator. It tells me -5.3. And so then I know that B is -5.3. Okay, and I just did that in the calculator because that was complicated math to do mental math or do by hand. So then the equation of that line is y equals -2/5 x minus 5.3. All right, you ready for the last one, or do we need a 1 minute break?
1 minute break.
1 minute break, okay. Recording. Okay, our last orthocenter is the easiest because we already have what we need. So we already have those slopes of 5/2, -5/6, and 0. We already have those perpendicular slopes, which are our -2/5, our +6/5, and our undefined. The only difference with orthocenter is instead of starting at midpoint, we're starting at the opposite vertex. So what is our opposite vertex to GI? Yeah. Okay, so H. So it's just the letters that's not in that line. So I'm going to start at H, and I'm going to, from H, count out my negative 2/5 slope. So I'm going to go up 2 and backwards 5. And that lands me a solid point that I can then graph between H and that point that I counted out. And I check, it does look perpendicular. All right, where do I start? What's opposite to IH? Yeah, so I start at G, and from G, thankfully this one does fit pretty well on my graph. I count up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I do have to go off 1. So 5, 6, and then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So I'm just counting out my 5 and 6, get an extra point here. Make sure that still looks perpendicular, especially since I went off the graph a little bit. And then undefined, which point do I start at? What's opposite to GH? Okay, so I just start at I, come straight down that line. Undefined are the easiest. Okay, and we aren't going to review finding the equation again, but this time I have, the point I have is the vertex. So if I was finding a line of this, I'd use point H, and then the slope that I already have. And then I go through exactly the steps I did above it. So if I was finding my line with H, I'd use my H point from my x1, y1, and then my slope would be the negative 2/5. Okay, that is our note.